Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
In the highlands of Ethiopia, surrounded by ancient monasteries carved into cliffs and wrapped in the incense of centuries-old ritual, lies a version of biblical history that predates the one known to most of the Western world. It is here that the air hums with chants in Guizi, a language older than Latin, older than Arabic, and certainly older than English. This sacred script cradles a version of Genesis untouched by Roman editing, untainted by imperial theology, and unfiltered by European conquest. To many Ethiopians and those aware of the ancient roots of Africa's spiritual traditions, the Book of Genesis is presented in modern Bibles as not just incomplete. It is a distortion, a historical and political rewrite of a much older, more authentic origin story. The Book of Genesis, as preserved in the Hebrew Torah and later absorbed into Christian and Islamic traditions, has been widely regarded as the foundational text of Western religious thought. Its sweeping narrative of creation, the fall of man, the flood, and the patriarchs is deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of billions. But what if the version known today was not the first? What if its authors borrowed, rewrote, and selectively erased stories that were already old by the time they put quill to parchment? Ethiopia, a land whose spiritual legacy stretches beyond the reach of European historians, offers compelling clues. The Kebra Nagast, the revered Ethiopian chronicle compiled in the 14th century, but based on much older oral and written traditions, recounts a cosmology and ancestral lineage that strikingly differs from the Genesis canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, retains books in its biblical canon that are considered apocryphal or heretical by Western churches. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Adam and Eve, texts long removed from Western Bibles, are preserved, read, and revered in Ethiopia. These writings offer a creation story rooted in African cosmology, where angels walk among humans, divine councils debate the fate of nations, and the bloodline of humanity flows directly through Africa, not Mesopotamia. Long before the Council of Nicaea convened in 325 CE to determine which scriptures were canon and which were heresy, Ethiopians were already safeguarding a religious tradition passed down from the ancient kingdom of Aksum and even earlier from Kush and Nubia. These civilizations, deeply spiritual and literate, had connections with ancient Egypt and the Levant, yet maintained their own theological interpretations. Egyptian creation myths, Sumerian legends, and early Hebrew tales all swirl together in this cultural cauldron. But in Ethiopia, the resulting narrative remains strikingly original. While the Genesis of the Torah portrays a patriarchal lineage rooted in the Middle East, the Ethiopian traditions emphasize a broader African ancestry, where Adam and Eve were not whitewashed and exiled from a Mesopotamian paradise, but were formed of African earth, surrounded by African rivers, and lived under African skies. The rewriting of Genesis occurred over centuries and was driven by theocratic politics and cultural conquest. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek during the Hellenistic period, the Septuagint, and later into Latin under the Roman Empire, the Vulgate, profound alterations occurred. Names were changed. Locations were adapted. The universal flood myth was streamlined to resemble Sumerian epics like Gilgamesh, and genealogies were truncated to conform to emerging Jewish and Christian doctrines. The Ethiopian versions, however, retained alternative details, sometimes with more spiritual depth, and sometimes with outright contradiction to the sanitized Genesis. In the Book of Jubilees, for instance, which survives only in full in Guizi, angels are actively involved in the lives of men, and the law is given to Enoch generations before Moses. This undermines the entire Mosaic-centered theology of modern Judeo-Christianity. Further unraveling the myth of Genesis as the original story is the remarkable preservation of the Book of Enoch in Ethiopia. Enoch, great-grandfather of Noah, is only briefly mentioned in Genesis as a man who walked with God and was no more. But in Ethiopia, Enoch is a prophet who journeys through the heavens, encounters angelic rebellions, and records divine secrets about the nature of the universe, the calendar, and the coming judgment. This vision-rich account influenced early Christian thought and is even quoted in the New Testament. Yet it was banned from the Western canon by later church councils. Ethiopia kept it because they were not under the dominion of Rome. In fact, they were Christianity before the West was Christian. What makes the Ethiopian story so compelling is not just its age or its mysticism, but its consistency with archaeological and anthropological evidence. Ethiopia, home of the oldest hominid fossils like Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, is regarded as the cradle of humanity. Its rivers, especially the Gyan, mentioned in Genesis as one of the 4 rivers flowing from Eden, are real and flow through real African terrain. The geography of Eden, long debated by biblical scholars, fits more accurately in East Africa than in modern-day Iraq. It raises the chilling possibility that Genesis was not describing a mythological past from elsewhere, but appropriating a story whose setting, characters, and spiritual framework were unmistakably African. This would mean that the Genesis we know today is not a revelation from God to man, but carefully curated script, a political and theological adaptation of older African texts. That adaptation severed the ties between the divine and Africa, replacing black divinity with white patriarchs and spiritual tradition with colonial doctrine. When Genesis was used by missionaries to convert Africans, it was in fact a case of the colonized being sold a rewritten version of their own stories. Moreover, Ethiopian traditions about the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, about the Ark of the Covenant being preserved in Aksum, and about the lineage of Christ flowing through Ethiopian bloodlines, all point to a radically different understanding of sacred history. In the West, these accounts are considered folklore. In Ethiopia, they are history. The Queen of Sheba is not a mysterious foreigner, but a national matriarch. Her union with Solomon is not an exotic tale, but the foundation of a dynasty. And the Ark is not a legend. It's said to be hidden in a chapel guarded by monks who die before revealing its secrets. The Book of Genesis, as taught to billions, is not necessarily fake in the sense of being entirely fabricated. Rather, it is fake in its claim to originality and completeness. It is a version, one of many, and arguably not the most ancient or authentic. The Ethiopian scriptures, older in form, broader in scope, and deeply African in worldview, offer a window into a story that existed before canon, before colonization, and before whitewashed religion. To confront this truth is to challenge everything the West has taught about creation, history, and divine authority. It is to acknowledge that Africa was not a spiritual desert waiting to be enlightened by missionaries, but a holy ground whose wisdom was stolen, rewritten, and returned as foreign gospel. Ethiopia's ancient biblical tradition reveals not only the flaws in Genesis, but the identity theft at the heart of religious history. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.